GLM 5.2 output tokens cost 5.7 times less than Claude Opus 5. That gap is real, it's verified, and it changes the math completely for anyone running these models at scale. Both models dropped recently and people are picking sides fast. So I ran Claude Opus 5 and GLM 5.2 through 5 real tests, coding, cost, speed, languages, and context. Every number is sourced. No vendor money, no spin. Honestly, the model that wins on raw coding ability doesn't win this comparison overall. And the tiebreaker comes down to one specific workflow decision. That might not be the one you're expecting. So this comparison is for you if you're building something real, right? You're calling an API, you're watching costs, or you need a model that actually works across languages. And picking the wrong one means you're either overpaying by a lot or shipping a product that breaks on non-English input. And that's a real cost, not a hypothetical one. All right, so test one is reasoning and coding. And this one stings when it goes wrong because bad code output means your agent loops, your CI fails, and you're burning tokens debugging something the model introduced. Weak coding model doesn't just slow you down, it costs you real money on retries and wasted compute. What surprised me here is how clean the SWE-bench pro gap is. Claude Opus 5 hits 79.2%. GLM 5.2 comes in at 62.1%, and that's a 17-point spread on the same benchmark. I was expecting more direct head-to-head data, but honestly, most of GLM's other scores like Frontier SWE have no Opus 5 number to compare against. So take those with a grain of salt. Claude Opus 5 takes test one. I was expecting a closer fight, and on some benchmarks it probably is, but on the one test where both models have a number, Opus 5 wins by 17 points. That's a real lead on the only apples-to-apples coding data we've got. So the score sits at Claude Opus 5 1, GLM 5 2 0. Now, test 2 is pricing and cost. And this is the one that bites you because you don't feel it on a single call. You feel it on your invoice at the end of the month. Run a high output workflow at scale, and the wrong pricing tier can add hundreds or thousands of dollars to your bill without you changing a single line of code. I looked at the standard API rates, and the gap is pretty wild. Opus 5 is $5 per million input tokens and $25 per million output tokens. GLM 5.2 is $1.40 on input and $4.40 on output, so that's 3.6 times cheaper on input and 5.7 times cheaper on output. Opus 5 does have batch pricing at 50% off, but even then, GLM 5.2 still undercuts it. GLM 5.2 wins test 2, and honestly, I didn't expect the gap to be this wide. I thought Opus 5's batch discount would close things up, but even with that, GLM 5.2 is still way cheaper on output, plus it's got a free tier through chat.z.ai. So now we're tied. Claude Opus 5.1, GLM 5.21. Okay, so test 3 is latency and response speeds. Slow first token times wreck user-facing products because people feel that pause and they bounce. And in agentic loops, a sluggish model compounds across every step. So a 3-second delay on one call becomes 30 seconds across a 10-step chain. The speed is not a nice to have in production. I looked at what's actually published here, and this is where things get frustrating. Opus 5 has independently measured latency data about 3.1 seconds to first token on low effort mode, streaming at around 53 tokens per second. GLM 5.2 has 0 published latency figures from any independent source, and that's a real blind spot if you're planning a production deploy. This one's a tie, and not a satisfying one. I was expecting at least some community benchmark for GLM 5.2, but there's nothing verified, and you can't call a winner without data on both sides. So the scoreboard stays at Claude Opus 5.1, GLM 5.21, 1 tied. And if latency is your thing, you're flying blind on GLM right now. S4 is multilingual capability. And when this breaks, it breaks your whole product for an entire market. You ship something that works great in English, you try to expand, and the model starts producing garbled output or just refuses to engage properly in French or Spanish or Japanese. And that's not a minor bug. That's a market you can serve. What I found here is pretty one-sided. Opus 5 supports many languages and has 3 verified multilingual benchmarks backing that up, while GLM 5 supports English and Chinese only and has 0 verified multilingual benchmarks listed anywhere. So if your users speak anything other than those 2 languages, GLM 5.2 is just not a real option for you right now. Claude Opus 5 takes test 4, no contest. I was expecting GLM 5.2 to at least have some multilingual coverage given its positioning, but English and Chinese only is a hard wall. Opus 5 has 3 verified benchmarks across multiple languages and GLM has none. So that puts us at Claude Opus 5.2, GLM 5.21, 1 tied. So test 5 is context window and long documents. And the failure mode here is annoying because it's silent. You feed a model a huge document or ask it to generate a long report and it just cuts off. You don't always get an error. You just get a truncated output. And now you're stitching together multiple calls to do what should have been one job. Both models match on input, 1 million tokens each, which is genuinely solid, and I wasn't expecting a gap there, but on output, it's a different story. Opus 5 caps at 128,000 tokens on sync calls and 300,000 on batch, while GLM 5.2 can output up to 1 million tokens in a single call, which is roughly 8 times more output than Opus 5's sync limit. Now, take a second before calling this a landslide, right? Most real workflows don't need million token outputs, and if you're doing summarization, Q&A, or code generation, Opus 5's 128,000 sync limit is probably more than enough. This gap only really matters if you're generating massive documents of full code bases in one shot, which is a pretty specific use case. GLM 5.2 takes test 5 on output length alone. I was expecting the shared 1 million token input window to make this a tie, but the output gap is just too big to ignore. 1 million versus 128,000 is not close. And that brings us to Claude Opus 5.2, GLM 5.22, one tied. So we're all square going into the final call. Claude Opus 5 wins on 3 things. Coding, 79.2% on SWE Bench Pro versus 62.1% for GLM 5.2. That's a 17-point lead on the only direct test we have. Multilingual, it works across many languages with 3 verified benchmarks, while GLM 5.2 is English and Chinese only, and batch API pricing at 50% off for async workloads. GLM 5.2 wins on cost and output scale. Standard output tokens are 5.7 times cheaper than Opus 5, and it has a free tier through chat.z.ai that Opus 5 simply doesn't have. And on top of that, GLM 5.2 can generate up to 1 million output tokens in a single call, which is 8 times more than Opus 5's sync limit of 128,000. It also ranked number 1 in Design Arena for creative work. Honestly, I was expecting Opus 5 to pull ahead on the overall score, but it's a dead tie at 2 wins each. So here's the decision rule. If you need strong coding accuracy and your product serves users in multiple languages, Claude Opus 5 is your pick. If you're cost sensitive, running at scale, or need massive single shot output, GLM 5.2 wins on price, and 5.7 times cheaper on output is a number that's pretty hard to argue with.